12 of the world's top supercar specialists, 6 consecutive days, hundreds of thousands of dollars in diagnostic fees. Sebastian Holt's $4 million hypercar sat silent as a slab of dead metal. Not a single warning light, not a single error code, just absolute mechanical silence that mocked every piece of precision equipment pointed at it. Not one of them found the answer. Then a man appeared, grease on his hands, a faded work shirt, eyes calm in a way that unsettled everyone in the room. Ryan Calloway, a single father. A mechanic from a roadside garage that didn't even have a proper sign out front. He leaned in, looked for less than 2 minutes, pulled one wire, and the car screamed back to life. But that wire didn't just start the engine. It brought down the entire empire Sebastian Holt had built on a lie. Sebastian Holt was the kind of man who measured respect in dollar amounts and expected the world to convert accordingly. At 51, he ran Holt Dynamics with the precision of a man who had never once accepted second place. A $2.3 billion electronics company that supplied high-performance components to racing teams and supercar manufacturers across 4 continents. His offices in Newport Beach occupied an entire floor of a building he also owned, and the only art on the walls were framed patents, each one a trophy of something his company had acquired, absorbed, or outlasted. He didn't collect victories, he cataloged them. The garage at his Newport Beach estate was 4,000 square meters of climate-controlled reverence, 23 supercars arranged with the precision of a museum installation. There was a pearl-white Bugatti Chiron Supersport near the entrance, a matte black Pagani Huayra Roadster behind it, and a 1 of 7 Ferrari Monza near the far wall. Each car wore its own lighting rig, each had its own service log maintained by a rotating team of certified technicians. But at the center of it all, positioned the way a cathedral positions its altar, sat the car Sebastian called the Verdict, a Koenigsegg Jesko Absolute, chassis number 007 of 125 ever produced, finished in a phantom titanium paint blended exclusively for this order. 1,600 horsepower, a theoretical top speed no road could legally contain, a price at current appraisal of $4.2 million. Sebastian didn't simply own cars. He claimed to understand them on a level that surpassed the engineers who built them. He had written technical pieces for automotive journals, spoken at industry conferences about the philosophy of mechanical perfection, and once corrected a Koenigsegg senior engineer during a factory visit, loudly in front of a group, while the engineer smiled the thin smile of a man who knew better than to argue with someone holding the invoice. That was the nature of Sebastian's world. Money didn't just talk, it rewrote the script. Diana Mercer had worked as his executive assistant for 7 years, which was 6 years longer than most people lasted in that role. She was 38, precise in everything she did, and possessed of a quality Sebastian had never once recognized in her: good judgment. She managed his schedule, his correspondence, and the emotional weather of every room he walked into. And on the morning Sebastian walked into the garage and found the Verdict completely, inexplicably silent. Diana was 3 steps behind him, watching his face with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to read the tremors before the earthquake. He pressed the ignition twice. The dashboard lit, the system cycled, and then nothing. The engine did not turn over. The Koenigsegg sat there, every indicator reading normal, every system reporting green, the fuel tank full, the oil pressure correct, the battery holding charge, and yet the car refused to start. Sebastian pressed the button a 3rd time, then a 4th, then he stood very still for a long moment, and Diana, watching from the doorway, recognized something she had almost never seen on that face before: uncertainty. He turned to her and said, in a voice stripped of its usual authority, "Get Carter Wells on the phone. Whatever he charges, pay it." Carter Wells arrived within 2 hours of the first call. He was considered one of the top 5 supercar technicians in North America, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s who carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who had never walked away from a car he couldn't fix. His team of 4 arrived with him, rolling in diagnostic equipment worth $80,000 in a custom transport van, and Carter shook Sebastian's hand with the easy assurance of a surgeon greeting a patient, took one walk around the Verdict, and said the words that would haunt him for the next 6 days: 48 hours, and I'll have your answer. Sebastian nodded. In his experience, problems responded to sufficient money applied with sufficient confidence. The symptoms were genuinely strange, and even Carter had to admit it to his team after the first day. No fault codes, no error flags in the ECU log. The electrical system read normal across every diagnostic protocol Carter's team ran: voltage, resistance, signal timing, ground continuity, relay function checks across every module in the harness. The fuel delivery system was perfect. The starter motor bench tested clean. The battery held full charge. There was, by every measurable standard, absolutely nothing wrong with the car, and yet the car would not start. After 36 hours of continuous testing, Carter proposed the most expensive solution he could construct: replace the entire engine control unit. The reasoning was sound enough. If no fault could be found in the car's systems, perhaps the unit that monitored those systems was corrupted in a way that couldn't self-report. Sebastian authorized the work without blinking. The replacement ECU was sourced overnight at considerable cost, installed by morning, and the car still did not start. Carter stood at the workbench for a long time staring at the original unit, and the expression on his face was one his team had never seen before. By day 3, Sebastian had made additional calls. A specialist flew in from Stuttgart, a man who had spent 20 years working on high-output European powertrains and had once diagnosed a fuel system fault that had stumped an entire manufacturer's technical team for weeks. A second expert arrived from Dubai, where he maintained the private car collections of several members of the royal family and had seen every kind of exotic failure that wealth and climate could produce. A third was a former McLaren powertrain engineer who had transitioned into private consulting after a career that had taken him through multiple Formula One development cycles. Each brought their own equipment. Each had their own theory. None of them agreed with each other, and none of them agreed with Carter, who by that point had quietly stopped asserting any timeline at all. The former McLaren engineer recommended a complete point-to-point wiring inspection. Every conductor in the car's harness tested individually for resistance, continuity, and signal integrity, a job that would take 3 full days and cost $90,000 in labor alone. Sebastian authorized it without hesitation. The results, delivered in a 40-page technical report, came back entirely clean. On day 5, Sebastian stopped being politely impatient and became something colder. He sat Diana down and told her to contact every credentialed supercar technician on the North American continent. He didn't care about cost. He didn't care about scheduling conflicts. He wanted answers, and if 12 people couldn't produce them, he would find the 13th who could. By the morning of day 6, 5 additional specialists had arrived. A professor of automotive engineering from MIT who brought 2 graduate students and a portable laboratory's worth of sensing equipment, and a factory technician who had been flown directly from the Koenigsegg facility in Ängelholm, Sweden, a man who carried proprietary diagnostic software that existed nowhere outside the manufacturer's own network. The factory technician spent 12 hours on the car, running diagnostics that none of the other specialists had access to, consulting by video with colleagues in Sweden, and at the end of it delivered a conclusion that made Sebastian's jaw tighten visibly. "We have never seen this before." He said it without apology, which somehow made it worse. The total cost after 6 days was $340,000. 12 specialists, 0 answers. Carter Wells, who had been the first called and somehow remained throughout, perhaps out of professional stubbornness, perhaps because leaving felt like admitting something, sat on a stool near the workbench on the evening of day 6 looking at a car he could not explain. He leaned toward his assistant and said quietly, in a voice he clearly believed no one else could hear, "That thing is haunted." Diana, standing near the door with her tablet and the careful expression she always wore when she was thinking something she would not say aloud, looked across the garage at Sebastian. It was the first time in 7 years of working for the man that she had seen him with no play left to make. He was standing with his arms folded, staring at the verdict, and the car stared back with $4.2 million worth of absolute indifference. Isaac Bowen had run his garage in Santa Ana for 31 years, and in that time he had built a reputation in a world most people didn't know existed: the underground network of master mechanics and independent technicians who kept rare and exotic machines alive outside the official service structure. Isaac was 62, built like someone who had spent 4 decades moving engine blocks by hand, and possessed of the particular shrewdness that comes from decades of reading people as precisely as he read machines. He heard about the Jesco situation through 3 layers of the network, each retelling adding more detail and more disbelief, and when the story reached him, 12 specialists, 6 days, $4 million, no answer. Isaac went quiet for a moment, then picked up his phone and called Diana Mercer's number. He had found it through the same network that had given him the story. He didn't pitch, he didn't negotiate. He said, "If you've already tried everyone, there's one person you haven't tried." Diana, who was operating on 4 hours of sleep and a growing suspicion that the situation was not going to resolve itself through conventional means, wrote down the name. Ryan Calloway worked out of Isaac's garage. He had no website, no professional listings, no framed certifications on any wall. He was 44 years old, lean in the way of someone who ate when he remembered to, with hands that carried the permanent evidence of a life spent inside engines. He had worked at Isaac's place for 9 years, since coming back from a period he didn't discuss with anyone, and he was, by any objective measure, the best diagnostic mind Isaac had ever encountered. Not the most credentialed, not the most publicly recognized, the best. There was a quality to his thinking that other mechanics noticed but couldn't easily name, an ability to hold an entire system in his head at once and find the fault that didn't fit the pattern, the thing that was wrong by being too right, the variable that looked normal and wasn't. The garage where Ryan worked told its story in details for anyone willing to look. A locked steel cabinet against the back wall held not tools but drawings, hand-rendered technical schematics for wiring architectures that Ryan had developed over a decade and a half, pages filled with annotations in a cramped, precise handwriting that suggested someone thinking faster than the pen could keep up. Under the workbench, in a shoebox that had once held a pair of steel-toed boots, there was a collection of IAMSA Racing Series Engineering Recognition Awards, not trophies for speed but acknowledgments of technical innovation. And pinned to the underside of a shelf, where almost no one would ever see it, a photograph from 2009, a racing team in a paddock, gathered around a car unlike anything on the circuit that year, and Ryan Calloway standing at its center with the particular expression of a man looking at something he had made from nothing. 15 years earlier, Ryan had been the co-founder of a company called Callaway Systems, a specialized engineering firm that developed intelligent electrical management architecture for high-performance vehicles. The core technology was an adaptive relay logic system designed to optimize power distribution in high-voltage automotive harnesses, a solution to a problem that had plagued exotic car manufacturers for years without a clean resolution. Ryan designed it, built the prototype in a rented workshop in Irvine, and spent 4 years refining it until it was something genuinely new. Not an improvement on existing technology, but a different way of thinking about the problem entirely. His co-founder, Adrian Soto, handled the business development side. For a time, it worked. The company was small but serious, and the technology was attracting interest from manufacturers who understood its potential. What ended it was not failure. His wife, Eleanor, was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition in 2010, and Ryan, without calculation, without regret, redirected himself entirely. He was present for her in every way that mattered, which meant he was increasingly absent from the company. He trusted Adrian to hold it steady. That trust was not honored. In the late months of 2010, while Ryan was managing hospital schedules and medication rotations, and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love diminish slowly and precisely, Adrian Soto entered into negotiations with a buyer he had identified through a mutual contact. The buyer was Sebastian Holt. The acquisition closed in 6 weeks. The patent at the center of the company, United States Patent Number 8,934,271, was transferred in a document that bore Adrian's signature and not Ryan's. Eleanor died in early 2011. Ryan found out about the sale 2 months later, absorbed the information in the same numbness that had absorbed everything in those months and made no move. The move came 18 months ago when a former in-house counsel at Holt Dynamics, a woman who had left the company after a restructuring and had carried something uneasy ever since, reached out to Ryan with a copy of the internal acquisition memo from 2011. At the bottom of the memo, in Sebastian's own handwriting on the routing note, were 11 words: Callaway's signature not obtained. Proceed with closing on current timeline. When Isaac told him about the Jesco, read him the vehicle identification number over the phone, Ryan was silent for several seconds. Then he asked very quietly, "What year was it built?" Isaac read the number. Ryan said, "That car has a Holt Dynamics smart relay module integrated into the ignition harness." Isaac said, "How do you know that?" Ryan said, "Because I designed it." He was quiet again for a moment, and then he put down his work cloth, took off his shop apron, and picked up the canvas tool bag from the hook by the door. Ryan drove to Sebastian's estate in a 2007 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it and a dent in the passenger door he had never gotten around to fixing. He parked it directly in front of the $4 million garage, got out, and stood for a moment looking at the building with the patience of a man who was not trying to impress anyone. He carried a single tool bag, canvas worn at the handles, the kind that suggested use rather than presentation. He had not brought a laptop. He had not brought a diagnostic unit. He had brought his hands and what was inside his head. Carter Wells and the remaining specialists were still there, gathered near the workbench in the low-grade misery of people who had publicly failed at the one thing they were known for. When Ryan walked in, the assessment was immediate and unflattering, the truck visible through the open door, the faded shirt, the bag that contained nothing impressive. Carter glanced at Diana with the expression of a man who wanted to register an objection but wasn't sure what form it would take. Sebastian came forward and looked at Ryan the way he looked at things that had not yet established their value to him, which was to say, he looked through him. One sentence. "You're the mechanic from the roadside shop?" Ryan didn't answer the question directly. He set his bag down on the floor rather than on the workbench and said, "Before I look at the car, I need to know one thing. Has this vehicle been through Holt Dynamics for any kind of electrical integration work?" The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with the question itself and everything to do with who was being asked. Sebastian's expression tightened by a fraction. He confirmed it, yes. Holt Dynamics had integrated a next-generation load management system into the vehicle's harness. Proprietary technology, his company's own work. He said it with the slight emphasis of a man reminding himself of something. Ryan nodded once, said nothing further, and walked toward the car. Carter stepped into his path, not aggressively but deliberately, and said, "We've run every test available. There is nothing wrong with that car's systems. Whatever you think you're going to find, it isn't there." Ryan looked at him for a moment with something that was not dismissal and not deference. He said, "I know you didn't find anything, because you didn't know what you were looking for." Then he went around Carter and knelt beside the car. What happened next was described later by Diana in a way that stuck with everyone who heard it. He didn't use a single instrument. He walked around the vehicle once, slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back like someone taking a considered walk. He crouched at the front left wheel well and appeared to listen, not with any device but with his actual ear turned toward the chassis. He opened the hood and stood over the engine bay for perhaps 45 seconds, not touching anything, just looking at the harness routing with the focused attention of someone reading a document they wrote themselves. Then he traced a single run of cabling with 2 fingers, following it from a junction block near the firewall into a relay module housing mounted against the inner fender, a compact unit, unremarkable looking, labeled with a Holt Dynamics part number. He stopped there. He turned to Diana and asked in a completely level voice, "Do you have an alligator clip lead?" She found one in the tool cabinet along the wall and handed it to him. Sebastian had not moved. Carter had not moved. The graduate students from MIT were absolutely still. Ryan clipped one end of the lead to a terminal on the relay housing, connected the other end to an adjacent ground point, and looked back toward Sebastian. "Try it now." Sebastian sat in the driver's seat. His hand hovered over the ignition button for just a moment, the involuntary pause of a man bracing for another failure in front of an audience that had watched every previous failure accumulate. He pressed the button. The Koenigsegg Jesko Absolute came alive. The sound was something that bypassed language entirely. 1,600 horsepower spinning up in a sealed garage sent a physical pressure through the air that everyone in the room felt in their chests before they processed it in their minds. The engine note climbed, settled, and held, clean and absolute and completely, perfectly normal. After 6 days of silence, the verdict had spoken. Nobody moved for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 or 5 seconds. Carter Wells was looking at his own hands with the expression of a man trying to remember what they were for. The Koenigsegg factory technician, who had flown from Sweden with access to software no independent operator possessed, opened his mouth and said nothing. One of the MIT graduate students turned away and appeared to be examining something on the far wall that was not there. Diana Mercer pressed her hand over her mouth and stayed very still. Sebastian cut the engine and stepped out of the car. He walked to Ryan with measured steps and the expression of a man reassembling himself in real time. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, not quite steady but controlled. "Explain it." Ryan stood with his arms at his sides and began without preamble. The Holt Dynamics Smart Relay Module integrated into this car's ignition harness was designed to optimize voltage distribution during cold start sequences, a genuinely useful piece of engineering under most operating conditions. But the module contained a flaw in its logic architecture, a narrow set of conditions under which it would enter what engineers sometimes call a ghost lock state. A logical loop from which it could not self-exit and which it could not self-report, because the diagnostic pathway ran through the same module that had locked. When the ambient temperature dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit and the vehicle sat dormant for more than 72 consecutive hours, the relay would stop passing the start signal. Not because it was broken, not because any measurable parameter was out of specification, but because it was cycling endlessly through a conditional check it could not resolve. Every instrument pointed at the car read normal because nothing was broken. The relay was simply stuck in a loop of its own making. The solution was a momentary bypass. One bridging connection to interrupt the loop and reset the module's logic state. The permanent fix was replacing the smart relay with a standard passive unit, eliminating the feature that caused the fault. The feature, Ryan noted, was unnecessary for this application. The Jesco's own power management architecture didn't need it. The module had been solving a problem the car didn't have. The room was quiet when he finished. Carter Wells said after a moment, "This is a design flaw in the Holt Dynamics unit. We weren't informed this integration had been performed when we began the diagnostic process." He was building a case for himself in real time, and no one in the room was fooled by it. Sebastian did not look at Carter. He was looking at Ryan with an expression that had become purely computational, not gratitude, not embarrassment, but rapid private assessment. He turned to Diana and said, "Arrange payment. Standard rate $1,000. He said it in the tone of a man closing a transaction, which was the only register he had for ending an interaction that had cost him something he didn't yet know how to quantify. No one spoke. $1,000. For the work that $340,000 and 12 specialists had failed to produce. The number sat in the middle of the room like something dropped from a height. Ryan didn't respond immediately. He picked up his canvas bag from the floor, straightened up, and looked at Sebastian with an expression that was neither anger nor satisfaction, something older than both. He said, "I didn't come here for the money, Mr. Holt." Sebastian said, "Then why did you come?" Ryan reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and removed a piece of paper folded in quarters. He set it on the hood of the Koenigsegg. Still warm from the engine that had finally briefly lived again, he said, "I came to see whether you'd recognize what's in front of you." Sebastian said, "And what's in front of me?" Ryan said, "The thing you built your company on. It was mine." Sebastian looked at the folded paper on the hood. He did not reach for it immediately, but his right hand, hanging at his side, closed slowly into a fist. The paper was a photocopy of United States Patent Number 8,934,271, filed in 2009, listing two co-inventors, Ryan M. Callaway and Adrian Soto. The patent title read, "Adaptive Relay Logic for High-Voltage Automotive Harness Management." It was the foundational intellectual property upon which the Holt Dynamics Smart Relay product line had been built, the technology inside the very module that had just been explained to 12 credentialed specialists who hadn't known it existed. Sebastian knew this number. He had known it for 13 years. He picked up the paper, read it in the way of someone who already knows the contents but needs a moment to decide which version of himself will respond, and then said, "This patent was legally transferred." "I have the documentation," Ryan said. "I know you do. Adrian sold it to you for $4.7 million in 2011. The problem is that it was jointly owned, 50% each. A joint patent cannot be transferred without both inventors' signatures. Mine wasn't on the assignment agreement." The garage was very still. Carter Wells and the remaining specialist began one by one to find reasons to be elsewhere, gathering equipment, moving toward the door with the particular quiet of people who understand they have just walked into something they were not meant to witness. Within 3 minutes, Ryan and Sebastian and Diana were the only people remaining. Diana had her phone out, moving quickly through patent records and corporate filings, not because she doubted what Ryan was saying, but because she needed to see it herself. The patent number confirmed. The assignment date confirmed. The signatory list on the transfer document, one name. She looked up at Ryan, then at Sebastian, and said nothing. Sebastian shifted approaches the way a chess player abandons a piece. He said, "You've had 13 years to raise this. You said nothing. You made no claim. You filed no complaint. In law, that constitutes abandonment," Ryan said. "Statute of limitations on patent infringement runs 6 years from the date of discovery, not from the date the violation occurred. The clock starts when the injured party has sufficient evidence to bring a claim. I had that evidence 18 months ago. I filed suit in federal court 3 months ago. The first hearing is scheduled for November." The understanding that settled over Sebastian then was visible, not in his expression, which remained composed, but in the way he became very still, as if his body had recognized something his mind was still catching up to. Ryan hadn't appeared in his garage because a mechanic friend had heard about a broken car through the grapevine. This moment had been arranged. Ryan confirmed it without being asked. He said, "The Holt Dynamics relay module is currently licensed to 14 vehicle manufacturers. I've reviewed the licensing agreements. There's a contract with a German industrial consortium signed in 2019, $180 million. Total revenue attributable to my patent over 13 years is estimated at $47 million. That's what my attorneys have documented." Sebastian said nothing. Ryan said, "I'm not telling you this to negotiate. I'm telling you because you should know the shape of what's coming." What had happened in 2010 and 2011 came out then, not as accusation but as record. Eleanor's diagnosis, Ryan's withdrawal from the company, Adrian Soto's approach to Sebastian while Ryan was managing hospital visits and prescription schedules, and the particular loneliness of watching someone disappear slowly and precisely. The acquisition had closed in 6 weeks. Ryan had been sitting in a hospital room in Anaheim during the signing. He had learned about the sale 2 months after Eleanor died, in a phone call from a former company attorney who had called to offer condolences and inadvertently mentioned the deal, assuming Ryan already knew. He had not already known. He had absorbed the information in the same numbness that had absorbed everything in those months, and he had made no move. The move came 18 months ago when a former in-house counsel at Holt Dynamics reached out to Ryan with a copy of the internal acquisition memo from 2011. At the bottom of the memo, in Sebastian's own handwriting on the routing note, were 11 words: "Callaway signature not obtained. Proceed with closing on current timeline." Diana set her phone face down on the workbench. She looked at Sebastian for a long moment and then said quietly, "Sebastian, I need to speak with you privately before you say anything else to him." It was the first time in 7 years she had told him what to do rather than suggested it. Sebastian looked at her, and something in her expression, not judgment exactly, but a finality she had never shown him before, told him that she was not asking. Ryan drove west after leaving the estate, not toward Santa Ana but toward the coast. He pulled the truck into a lot at Huntington Beach and sat with the engine off, watching the last of the evening light dissolve into the water. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, the deep, structural fatigue of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and could now feel the weight of it differently, though not yet feel its absence. He opened the center console and took out a small USB drive in a plain case. No label, no identifying marks. On it was the complete original design archive for the adaptive relay logic system. Every file timestamped, every version logged, metadata intact and unmodified, a chain of evidence that his attorneys had already authenticated and filed with the court. He had carried it in his truck for 18 months. He turned it over in his fingers once, then put it back. He thought about Eleanor. Not the end of things, but a particular morning in 2008, when he had spread the first full schematic across the kitchen table, and she had stood looking at it with her coffee in both hands. She hadn't asked him to explain it. She knew enough to know she wouldn't fully understand the technical detail, but she had looked at it for a long time and then said, "I don't know what I'm looking at, but I know it's something important." He had laughed and said she was biased. She had said, "But I'm also right." His phone vibrated on the passenger seat. The screen showed Diana Mercer's name. He watched it for one ring, then picked up. She said, "I know you have no reason to trust me, but there's something you need to know before the November hearing, something your legal team doesn't have yet." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Not over the phone." He said, "All right." She gave him a time and an address. He said he'd be there, and he meant it. Diana met him the next morning at a coffee shop in Costa Mesa, a plain place with linoleum floors and coffee that came in ceramic mugs. She arrived before him and was already seated at a corner table with a manila envelope in front of her when he walked in. She looked like someone who had not slept well and had decided to stop being someone who waited for permission. She pushed the envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of every licensing agreement Holt Dynamics had executed using the adaptive relay logic technology, all 14 contracts, spanning 2012 through 2022. The agreements named the originating patent explicitly, included the revenue splits, the sublicensing terms, the renewal structures. The German consortium contract was there, $180 million, signed in 2019, with royalty structures generating continuing payments across multiple fiscal years. Total documented licensing revenue, $47.3 million. Diana said, "I copied these before I left the building last night. I've already resigned." Ryan looked at the documents for a long time without speaking, then he said, "Thank you," she said. "I should have done something sooner." He said, "You're doing it now." She looked at her coffee. He looked at the documents. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was a comfortable silence. The silence of two people who understood what the other one needed. Ryan's attorneys received the package by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, the senior partner, Margaret Ashford, 22 years in intellectual property litigation, called Ryan personally. The documents confirmed and exceeded the case already filed. This was not incidental infringement. This was systematic commercial exploitation of a stolen patent, documented across 13 years and 14 separate licensing relationships, with internal communications demonstrating that senior Holt Dynamics leadership had known the underlying IP was contested at the time of acquisition. Under the relevant federal statute, willful infringement carried the potential for treble damages, 3 times the calculated value of losses. Margaret's office would file the supplemental evidence brief within 48 hours. 72 hours before the first scheduled court hearing, Sebastian's legal team requested an emergency mediation session. The conference room was on the 24th floor of a downtown Los Angeles building, the kind of room designed to make the other side feel small, with floor-to-ceiling glass and a table long enough to seat 20. Ryan arrived with Margaret Ashford and Diana, who was now a named witness for the plaintiff. Sebastian sat at the far end of the table and did not look at Ryan when he entered. Attorneys arranged themselves in the practiced formation of people paid to present as confident regardless of the underlying position. The opening offer came within the first 10 minutes. $8 million, sealed settlement, mutual non-disclosure, Ryan surrendering all future claims against Holt Dynamics and its licensing partners. Ryan said no. The second offer was $15 million. Ryan said this isn't about a number. The lead attorney for Sebastian's team, a man who carried himself like the most expensive person in any room he entered, said, "Then tell us what you want, Mr. Calloway." Ryan had thought about this for 18 months. Not just about what the law allowed him to claim, but about what actually mattered, what could be undone, what couldn't, and what the difference was. He said 3 things. First, Holt Dynamics will file public disclosures amending the intellectual property documentation on every licensed product that uses this technology, retroactively, to accurately attribute the originating patent to Ryan M. Calloway. Not a press release, not an internal acknowledgement, a legal amendment to the public record. Second, all 14 existing licensing agreements will be renegotiated at standard royalty rates, with Ryan Calloway recognized as the patent holder going forward. Not a one-time payment, but a restructured arrangement that treats the intellectual property the way it should have been treated from the beginning. Third, and he paused here, $4.7 million. The exact amount Sebastian had paid Adrian Soto in 2011 to acquire the patent. Not because it represented the full value of the damages, but because it was the number Sebastian had placed on the work when he bought it, and Ryan wanted that number returned to its proper owner. Sebastian requested that the attorneys leave the room. Margaret looked at Ryan. Ryan nodded. The room emptied until it was 3 people at a long conference table, 24 floors above the street. Sebastian looked at Ryan for the first time since the meeting had begun, looked at him directly, without the computational assessment of earlier, without the performance of authority. He said, "You know, in 2011, I was aware that your signature wasn't on the transfer agreement." He said it without inflection, like a fact being entered into the record rather than a confession being offered. "I told my team to proceed anyway. I told myself that you were grieving, that you were distracted, that you would either not notice or would lack the capacity to respond." He stopped. Ryan waited. Sebastian said, "I was wrong about what you were capable of. There was no theatrical remorse in it. There was no performance of regret designed to reduce his liability." He said it because it was true, and something in Ryan's expression told him that Ryan already knew it was true and had known it for some time. That sentence, spoken in a room with no audience in a voice too quiet for the attorneys outside to hear through the glass, was what Ryan had driven to Newport Beach to retrieve. Not the money, not the legal outcome, that. Ryan said, "I know." Then he said, "Let's sign." The agreement took 2 hours to finalize. It was everything Ryan had asked for. Margaret told him afterward in the elevator on the way down that she had never seen a settlement structure quite like it, not because it was unusually large, but because it was unusually specific. As if the person who designed it had spent a long time thinking about exactly what it needed to say, and had arrived at a document that was less about compensation than about correction. 3 months later, Isaac's garage in Santa Ana looked exactly the same as it had always looked. The radio above the parts bin was still playing country music at a volume slightly too loud. The floor still had the oil stain near Bay 2 that had resisted every cleaning effort for 12 years. The calendar on the wall was 2 months behind. Ryan was on a creeper under a 2003 Toyota Camry belonging to an elderly woman named Hannah, who lived 4 streets over and needed a new exhaust flex pipe. A job that paid $85 and would take 40 minutes. It was the kind of work that had no audience and required no explanation and was simply done or not done, and Ryan Calloway had always found that straightforward. Isaac leaned against the doorframe with a newspaper folded under his arm and watched Ryan work for a moment. Then he said, "I read something, a piece about the Holt Dynamics settlement, doesn't give the amount. Says terms are undisclosed." Ryan slid out from under the car, sat up and wiped his hands on a shop rag. Isaac held up the paper. Ryan glanced at it, then looked away. Isaac said, "Any regrets about settling instead of going to trial?" Ryan thought about it the way he thought about everything, not performing consideration but actually doing it. He said, "At trial the number would have been bigger, possibly much bigger, but a verdict doesn't make a man say something he doesn't want to say." Isaac said, "And what did Sebastian say?" Ryan said he was wrong. Isaac waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Isaac nodded slowly, folded the newspaper, and went back inside. Diana Mercer had established an independent consulting practice and was doing well. She and Ryan were not close in any sentimental sense, but there was between them the particular regard that exists between people who have chosen the right thing in the same difficult moment and recognize it in each other without needing to discuss it. She sent him a message when the amended patent disclosures were filed in the public record. A single line. "It's there now." He replied, "I saw." Carter Wells gave an interview to an automotive podcast several weeks after the story circulated through the industry. Carefully, without using names, the way people discuss things they know but cannot fully document. He was asked what the situation had taught him. Carter said, "The lesson is that the person who knows the most isn't always the one with the most equipment." He said it with reasonable dignity, and no one who knew the full story failed to understand who he was talking about. In all Holt Dynamics product documentation related to the Smart Relay Module, technical manuals, licensing agreements, patent filings submitted to regulatory bodies in 7 countries, there now appeared a small line of required disclosure text, based on technology originally developed by Ryan M. Calloway, 2008 through 2009. It appeared in the same typeface as the surrounding legal boilerplate, the same font size, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Sebastian had signed the amendment without comment. Ryan finished the exhaust flex pipe on Hannah's Camry, rolled out from under the car, and stood. She was waiting near the door with her purse already open, counted out $85 in cash and handed it over with both hands with the quiet generosity of someone for whom $85 was a considered amount. She told him he was talented. He thanked her and said he just knew a few things. He watched her drive carefully out of the lot, signaling at the exit even though there was no traffic, and then he turned back to the garage. Somewhere out on the boulevard, a supercar passed. High revving, something Italian by the sound of it, running hard through a gap in traffic the way those cars always seem to run, as if the road itself were an inconvenience. Ryan heard it without looking up. He picked up his shop rag and went back to work.